We'll wait a couple more minutes for everyone else to join. I've got a couple things prepared. I sent you guys a screenshot of the app and a screenshot of just a drawing that I did on a whiteboard that kind of explains the friction circle a little bit. So before we really talk about the apex lights and what they mean, we've got to discuss the friction circle and what it is. So we'll do that first. And I'll send you some follow-up content on the friction circle. I've got about a 40-minute video that goes into all sorts of detail on the friction circle. A lot of us have heard about the friction circle or the traction circle or the GG plot before. So definitely give me some feedback on, if you've heard about it, if you haven't, if this is a totally new concept, because it's extremely, extremely helpful. I'm going to send out one more email blast with the click to join link to make sure, we got everybody on here that is going to join, because we're still missing a couple of folks. Sorry if I'm blowing up your inboxes, guys. I'll try not to include your email if you're already on here. While we're waiting for folks, if you guys can pull up the data sessions that I sent you and upload them into your app if you haven't already. If you can't, don't worry about it. Just follow along. We'll try to get through this in a timely manner. So that's just more meant to help you follow along with what I'm doing. You can also use your own data. We'll only spend a few minutes on those kind of at the end, and then we'll have a couple of quizzes that we're going to do to help us solidify this information and be able to use it going forward. Send one more email out here. Alrighty. So you guys will just have one more email from me asking you to join. All right, we got Al Demisco now. Al, welcome. Al, let us know where you're from, what you drive, how long you've been using Apex Pro. New Jersey or upstate New York? I forget, New Jersey, New York area. Forget exactly. And you have an E30, I know that. Awesome. Todd, how do you load the files into your Apex Pro? Todd, if you open that email, yes, Michael, it can. So open the email that I sent you that has the data attached, and go to the bottom of the email where the attachment is. You'll see, it'll say Barber Apex Data, some other words. Tap that file. That's the first step, tap that file. I'll show you real quick. So to upload the data, let's see, I'm gonna share my iPad. Go into my email. I'm going to, let's see if I can find, there we go. So I'm looking at this Barber Motorsports Apex Data file right here. Just tap on this file where my mouse is, and it'll look like this. You'll see a screen appear like this. The next step here is going to be to tap the kind of typical iOS import button. It's that square with an arrow in it. Tap that. Sometimes this does funky things when it's attached to stuff. You shouldn't have the same issue that I do, but what you'll see right here, instead of this blank screen, for whatever reason, mine's not wanting to work. It's probably because I'm tethered via AirPlay to the computer. But you'll see options for where to open it listed in here. If you don't see the Apex Pro app icon, tap More. There'll be a little area where you can tap More, and then you'll be able to open it. Just scroll down and find Apex Pro, and that'll upload them into the app automatically. Should be fairly straightforward once you get to that point. Cool, Todd's got it. All right. Well, we'll start at the beginning here, guys. So Don't worry if you can't get the file loaded. That was just meant to be, I meant to send that out earlier, and it's obviously we've all had a hectic week. So first of all, thank you for joining us. I really, really, really appreciate it. These webinars, we've been planning on charging for webinars for a while because one, I've noticed when I do free webinars, people don't show up, even if they sign up. Interesting. It's like a mental thing. So when you actually invest a little bit in it, people show up. And two, this is really helpful for our business. Like most small businesses right now, it's going to be really tough, especially with all the tracks closed. No one's able to use the product. So helping, getting people to engage with the product and using it and learning it is the best thing we can do right now. So thank you very much for taking the time. Abe Schmucker, welcome, man. Glad you're on. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about the friction circle. And I'll try to explain it in ways that, first of all, make sense to me. So please ask me a question. If you don't understand, please, please, please get into the chat box or the Q&A and ask for clarification. I'll try to explain it in a couple different ways. I spend a lot of time explaining these things. That doesn't mean that what I say will make sense to you right away. And doesn't have to either. It'll take a little bit of time to marinate. So I'm going to share just a screen, and I sent you guys an email with some stuff that kind of looked like this earlier. So what we are looking at here is the basis of what our friction circle is going to look like. This is the longitudinal and lateral G plot. Okay, I'll show it to you in the app, and then we'll come back to this as well. So we're going to spend some time here on the friction circle before we talk about apex score. And we can do a follow-up webinar to this as well. So guys that just joined us, let us know where you're from, what you drive, and how long you've had an Apex Pro or been using Apex Pro. And the Q&A box is for your questions. So ask your questions there. We're not going to go super in depth on the friction circle, but in order to get to where apex score makes sense, we've got to explain it. So the progression of the webinar is going to be a little bit on the friction circle. What is it? What's it made up of? And then we're going to go into how apex score is very similar, but different. So the goal is just to kind of understand those two things. If we go a little bit further and talk about how to use apex score to go faster, that'll be great. I'm totally expecting that we want to do a follow-up on that, and we'll schedule a webinar here with respect to what you guys are doing. Cool, so I'm gonna do some annotations on our whiteboard here. So when we look at our friction circle in the app, we'll do that in just a second. It's gonna kind of look something like this. We're gonna see this shape that goes like that, okay? And so really simply, you might have seen the icon that I sent in the email. We've got longitudinal G up here. That's forward acceleration. And negative longitudinal G down here. So what the friction circle is doing is graphically displaying the accelerations that we feel in the car. So try to relate everything that we talk about here with what you're feeling. So an acceleration that's plotted right here, I'm going to change this to an arrow to make this make a little more sense. Let's make it yellow. An acceleration that's plotted right here at 0 lateral G, positive longitudinal G, gas pedal, right, going straight. On the other end, something plotted right here, an acceleration that gets plotted right there on the friction circle is going to be braking hard in a straight line. Negative longitudinal G, braking in a straight line. Cool. Positive longitudinal G, accelerating. Negative longitudinal G, braking. So it's quite literal. So positive G's get plotted up here. Negative G's get plotted down here. And hopefully you guys saw that screenshot I sent you of the app. Ask questions as we go in the Q&A, and I'll get to them at the end. That if you haven't seen the friction circle in the app before, hopefully you saw that and at least saw what the shape looked like, what the colors were, that sort of thing. If not, feel free to ask questions about it. Ask any questions that you want here. There's no expectations for having any knowledge about this beforehand. Conversely, if you do know stuff about this, ask those questions too. So now lateral G. Most of us are familiar with that term, lateral G, right? That's cornering forces. All right, 0 right here, right, where the intersection is. The lines are your 0 axes, right? 0 and 0. Negative lateral G. Negative lateral G. That's going to be left-hand corners. Okay, that's going to be turning the steering wheel to the left. Or like this. So what's really important to think about on the friction circle is that how the G's are plotted are literal, not based on where the load is necessarily, right? So when we turn to the left, the load is on the other side of the car, right? The right side tires get loaded. But most friction circles are going to plot left turns on the left side of the friction circle. Subsequently, they're going to plot right turns on the right side of the friction circle. All right, that's really important to think about because it can be kind of confusing if you get those crossed. All right, left side of the friction circle is left turns. So literally think about turning the steering wheel. Left turn, body goes to the right. Left side friction circle plotting for lateral G, and same thing to the right. Right turn, right side friction circle plotting for lateral G. Positive lateral G, right turns, negative lateral G, left turns. What's important to know is almost every data system that exists is going to use negative values for lateral G with left-hand turns. I don't know exactly why that's the case, but I've heard it has something to do with like medieval, somebody used a word I hadn't heard before, but it's basically how most people are right-handed in society, right? We see right as being correct, positive, good. It's a very old thing, but left-hand values are going to be negative. But for the friction circle, right, one's got to be positive and one's got to be negative for it to make sense. So that makes sense. All right. So before we go any further, let's do a real quick quiz. I'm going to point my arrow into a quadrant. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 quadrants here. Actually, I'm going to draw a number. Let's make this 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, guys. Now in the chat box, let me know what you see or what values would be plotted in quadrant 1. Is it positive long and positive lat? Is it negative long and negative lat? Let me know. Positive and negative. Lat and long. Positive lat, negative lat. Just be thinking about that. Leave that in the chat. We'll go back to that at the end. All right. Quadrant 1. Get back to the chat box here. Ding, ding, ding. We got it. Awesome, guys. Positive, positive. Sweet. All right, we're on the same page. That's great. Quadrant 1 is going to be positive, positive. Quadrant 2 is going to be negative lat, positive long, and you can go around the rest, right? The reason that's important is because that's how the values are going to be displayed. It's going to be negative lat, positive long, positive lat, positive long. Either way, lateral is going to be first, longitudinal is going to be second. All right, so let's stop this sharing, and then let's take a look at this same thing in the Apex Pro app. So I'm going to share the screen of my iPad, and bear with me, I'm using screen mirroring that's wireless, so it takes a little more bandwidth, so things might be a little slower. So let's look at the session that I sent you, which was, I believe, it was this one was the first one, which was our control session. I picked this session. This was me driving the car that I co-own with Paul Roddy, who's on here with us. Thanks, Paul. Co-driving that car. This was before we added Aero. I picked this session purposely because 1, it's decent control data, and 2, there is some opportunity with the Apex score and the friction circle that can be identified, but not a lot. It's kind of incremental. The other session that I sent you has enormous opportunity. Really poorly driven, poor technique. So I'll show you that. To get to the friction circle, guys, if you're watching along and you're using the app yourself, you're going to look for this toggle right here on the data review screen. Let's see. You're going to look for the toggle on the data review screen. Awesome. And as we go, ask questions in the Q&A, please. So this arrow right here, I'm going to tap it, and I'm going to go over twice. All right, I'm going to tap it twice. Cool. So now we're looking at the friction circle. I'm going to select one of the better laps over here because I don't really want to look at my outlap friction circle. It's not going to be very helpful. I'm going to go right here. So now I've got that lap 5 selected. You can see the blue check mark right there. All right. So now when we're looking at this friction circle, just like we were looking at on the whiteboard, we've got lateral G and longitudinal G. So these right here, these tickers in the middle of the screen are showing us what are being displayed, right? Lateral G, longitudinal G. This red color right here, that's showing us what we color the friction circle by. So you can change the color. I can go to green, I can go to blue, I can color it by the altitude of the track if I have lap timer plus. I can color it by really anything that I want. Color it by apex score, we'll come back to that. I can color it by lat G, I can color it by long G. This is something I would suggest doing, guys. If you're following along, pull up the friction circle like we did, toggle over to this page, and toggle between long and lat G, because this is what is being displayed. And so now what we see when we have it colored by lat G is we have negative values are red, positive values are green. Pretty easy to see. Neutral values are yellow. Now also, if we go to long, we're going to see the same thing, just on a different axis. So now we see red is negative, green is positive. So do that just for your own sake. Practice that when you're done. I'm going to go back to red here so we can just kind of see a plain friction circle. And I'm going to draw some lines at the 0 axis. All right, that's 0 longitudinal. I'm sorry, 0 lateral. And here's 0 longitudinal. All right. So that's our 0 axes. Let's try another quiz real quick. All right, guys, let me know in the chat box if I was accelerating in this quadrant right here. Call it quadrant 4. Give me a positive or negative lat and positive or negative long. Just like you did before. Is this positive lat and positive long? Is this negative lat and negative long? Is it negative lat and positive long? Let me know. Right here, quadrant 4. All right, looking good. Todd, that is correct. Brian, nailed it. Michael, nailed it. Al, let's rethink that one a little bit. Flip those. Got it. That's why we do this, because this is the main reason why. The main reason I see that people aren't able to use the friction circle is because it's too confusing to understand which one is which. So the purple arrow is pointing at, and we're going to use lateral first, positive lateral acceleration, because we're on the right side of that vertical axis is positive, right? And we can check that by going up here. Lateral, green, positive. Cool. So positive lateral and negative longitudinal, because it's below the horizontal axis, right? Below the horizontal. I can check that by going to long, and we're going to see these more red colored values. Todd said you were braking. That is correct. If I was right here, I would be actually braking and turning to the right. Braking and turning to the right. Very cool. And we'll show how we can identify that a little bit. So the friction circle is showing us, it's showing us what the car is experiencing and what we're experiencing as the driver when we're talking accelerations, right? So think about it like that. I like to think about the fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror, right? That's what's drawing the friction circle. Now we display it a little differently than what those dice would actually draw for it to make a little more sense graphically, but that's what it's experiencing. Have you guys ever seen the videos that they look like this crosshair right here without the friction circle plotting under it, and then there will be some circles that go on there. Move this out of the way. They'll have some circles that look like this. They get bigger and bigger. And these are just like people's track videos. And you'll see a little dot that bounces around. Right? Everybody seen that before? A lot of people overlay that in like Race Chrono or Harry's and they post it to YouTube. That's the same thing as the friction circle. It's plotting these points. So if you've done that before, if you log that kind of video, then you've experienced the friction circle. Okay? The thing that makes the friction circle not as useful is that the friction circle only tells us very literally what the car experienced. It gives us no indication about can the car do more. In other words, could the outside edge of that friction circle be bigger? So let's say your car is capable of 1.5 lateral G. 1.5 lateral G. If all you ever do is 1.2, how do you know that it's capable of more? You really don't, right? And that's where Apex Score comes in. All right, Apex Score comes in to help us answer that question. Could the friction circle be bigger? Or maybe could I fill in part of the friction circle that I'm not using currently? So let's talk a little bit about, we've defined the 4 quadrants. We know what's above the horizontal axis, forward acceleration on the gas pedal, below it, braking. Let's define a little bit what those axes mean when we talk about our hands and our feet. So if we're up here, if we're in quadrant 1, the further out to the edge we are, the harder right-hand cornering we're experiencing. Right, the further out we are, the more lateral G we're experiencing out here, lateral G. And I'm going to go back down to my single color here. The more lateral G that we are experiencing out there, let's see, maybe that'll appear better. So we're cornering to the right, but we're also accelerating. All right, we're also on the gas pedal. So if we're in quadrant 1, we're turning to the right and we're on the gas. If we're in quadrant 2, very, very similar, we're turning to the left and we're on the gas. All right, if we're in quadrant 3 right here, guess what? Actually, I don't know. You guys tell me in the chat box. If we're in quadrant 3, what does that mean our hands and our feet doing? Give me which way we're turning and which pedal you're on. Oh, we already got an answer. Left and braking. Braking, turning left. All right. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Absolutely. That's correct. Braking and turning left. And quadrant 4 is braking and turning right. Very cool. I hope these don't seem too simplistic, guys, but the more we go through this and just like really, really, really understand it, the easier it makes everything. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Very cool. Okay. So if we are in that quadrant 4, then we are braking and turning to the right. So what we'll commonly see on road courses is more right-hand corners and left-hand corners. So usually the right side of your friction circle is going to look a little more populated than the left side most of the time. All right, you'll also see some gaps every now and then. Even in really good driver's data, you'll see some little gaps in the friction circle. I'll point one out here. I've noticed this in mine. And usually those gaps are either defined by track conditions. It's very hard you don't actually experience that situation a lot. This is from Barber Motorsports Park, and that would be hard braking and turning to the right. And the 2 places where you're doing that, you're not really braking super hard. So you're usually going to see a little bit of a gap there. Also, it might be a driver confidence thing. If you see a gap like that, that's a particular corner where you're not that comfortable with the car. And we'll talk about how to figure out where on the track the friction circle is as well, because that's super important too. So let's talk a little bit more about Apex Score. So like I said, Apex Score is going to take friction circle values, and it's basically going to expose where on the friction circle there's more opportunity. That's what the lights display. So the green lights are showing you these plots on the friction circle. So let me draw in a circle here. The green dots, I'm going to make it green. They're showing you the outside edge. All right. I'm going to position this as best I can. They're showing you the outside edge of the friction circle. They're showing you this, right? They're showing you where those plots have been plotted on the very outside edge. Okay, I'll make it a little bit smaller to make it more realistic. Now our our red dots are showing us where they think that actually could be, right? So the red values are a little bit higher. That's basically red saying you might be accelerating at this right here, at this whatever combination of acceleration, but you could be doing a little more. Okay, so it's using values off of here, but it's taking more into consideration than the friction circle does. So the friction circle is literally longitudinal and lateral acceleration plotted on our XY graph. Apex score is taking longitudinal and lateral acceleration, but it's actually not. It's actually using a 9-axis accelerometer. So it's gaining 9 axes of acceleration, whereas long and lat are each basically a single axis of acceleration. Okay, so it's multi-dimensional. So it's basically using what we see here, the friction circle, but it's understanding if I'm right here on the friction circle at the very outside edge on lateral G turning to the right, that very peak G might not be attainable everywhere on the racetrack. Consequently, there might be places where it is attainable that we don't realize. Okay, that very peak G. So what you see when you see the little dot bouncing around on the circle and people talking about, I should be able to do 1.5 lateral G, that's not always true because track conditions vary enough that sometimes you can do 1.5 lateral G, but maybe the track is downhill while you're turning in and the car is loading up. You can't do 1.5 lateral G in that condition. Okay, does that make sense? So the topography of the track, and we're not going to be able to go over everything that Apex Score considers because that's extremely detailed and almost, I don't want to say infinite, but it's 9 axes of acceleration. So it's cambers in the track, right? Track camber. Is it cambered in your favor? We all know NASCAR tracks, right? They're cambered, they're banked. So the car doesn't have to slow down as much for the corner. If that was a flat corner, they'd have to slow down another 50 or 60 miles per hour, right? But it's banked. So we know we can carry more speed on cambered corners. Apex Score knows that. The Apex device understands that. So what it does is when it measures an acceleration, let's call it where this arrow is pointing, max lateral acceleration, it's going, where is that on the track? Where are we on the racetrack? And then what does the banking of the track look like right here? Is it flat? If it is flat, it assumes that you can do more if the track's cambered. All right, guys, if you have questions, Q&A box, please. Q&A box. That way I won't miss them. Brian, most of your hardest braking points are slightly to the plus. Let me move this around. Hold on, I need to. Since most of the hardest braking points are slightly to the positive lat, does that mean the car is pulling slightly under braking? I would think that the hardest deceleration points would be at the beginning braking on the straight. I've noticed the same thing on my lat long plot and was wondering why the biggest negative long are skewed positive lat. I see what you're saying. Brian, if it's around 0, so to answer that question, he's saying that he would assume that the hardest braking points would be right around 0 lateral G, so that you're not cornering. But what he sees is these dots down here are slightly on one side or another, either positive lateral or negative lateral. So Brian, to answer that question, I'll segue into my next conversation topic, which is we need to know where those plots are being created on the track. Because being at completely 0 lateral G is usually not the case. It's usually not exactly zero, right? The car is going to have, it's either going to sway a little bit when you hit the brakes hard. The accelerometer is going to pick up something. There is, I would call it a margin of error between 0.2 lateral, where those plots are all, if you're at peak longitudinal and it's between 0.2 lateral, either way, I wouldn't consider that lateral G. I would consider that zero. We can talk about that offline as well if you want. Let me go to some different screens here. So I'm going to pull the GPS image back up on the front. I've got longitudinal G displayed here. So long G is displayed over the racetrack. And I got that by selecting it right here. And then on the bottom, I'm going to go to the friction circle. Okay. So this is the best place to go if you're looking at, hey, where on the friction circle am I on the track? And Barber's pretty straightforward for friction circles. So what I'm going to do is take the slider in the bottom and I'm going to move the dot around the racetrack and I'm going to watch where the dot on the friction circle goes. So right now, you can see right here, we're turning to the right. We're slightly decelerating because long G is yellow. And that's where we're plotted down here. Also, guys, as you're doing this, look at these values right here. So the 3 values there were that last, and I will get rid of all these arrows and just point to that. Those values are showing you lateral, longitudinal, and in this case, apex score. So lateral, longitudinal, and apex score. So we're at 0.84 positive lateral G, negative 0.35 negative longitudinal G, and 0.81 apex score, which would be 80%, which means there's more potential. Right? So if we're at 80%, there's not a hard and fast rule. Hey, I'm at 80% apex score. That means I can do this many more G. It's more of a percentage thing. So the car could handle roughly at that point on the track, 20% more. The problem with using that as just a rote, okay, I can do 20% more there, is that maybe there's something that's about to happen to the car and that apex score is going to change very quickly based on topography. So we can't look at one place. We kind of have to look. There we go. So now we're up to 97. So see, the apex score was building. We'll talk about that here in a second. The further out to the edges on the friction circle, at any point on the friction circle, get rid of my, it looks like I'm spazzing out with the arrows. The closer to the edges of the friction circle we are, the higher the apex score. So you guys can see with apex score selected, see the green points are only on the edge. Anytime we're in the middle, that's a low value for apex score. Low value for apex score. What's really interesting is when you find some of these dots, like right here, and right here, and right here, that are yellow, meaning low apex score, but they're close to the edge of the friction circle. All right, if you see yellow dots close to the edge of the friction circle, that is usually the lowest hanging fruit. Those are the places where, okay, so if I'm looking at these dots right here, there's some yellow at the edge of the friction circle. That's telling me I'm braking, turning left. There's probably more potential of the car there. There's probably more total G available there, combined G. So what I'm going to do, and Brian, to answer your question, I'm going to drag the slider to where I'm accelerating in a straight line right here. And I'm going to play the lap forward. So let's watch. So right now I'm at exactly 0 lateral G. I'm braking hard, I'm at 0. And that was a very quick transition. So guys, the next data sample that I'll show you from the bad sample, this is not going to be the case. So let's pull that back. Watch my transition, and you can watch the apex lights. So I'm at red, and again, why do we see red lights on the apex device in a straight line? Because it's plotting points in this area. They're not at the edge of the friction circle. They're low value. That lowers the score. Now, if we slam on the brakes, we saw some red lights while we're transitioning down to the bottom of the friction circle, but they're going to turn almost all green pretty quickly. So what this is telling me right here is that I have a little bit of braking potential available to me, a little bit more available. So I could probably be a little more assertive with the brakes. And Brian, to completely answer your question on lateral, like I said, if it's within 0.2 either way, don't worry about it. But just keep in mind that accelerometers are very, very sensitive. So little tiny changes in the wheel, even like this kind of thing, they're going to pick up on. Also, the car is not going to uniformly just slow down at 0 lateral G, right? There's going to be some load transfer that's indicative, just natural. Like, I don't have an explanation for it because I'm not a physics major, but it's not always going to be 0. But if you look at this number right here, as we go through the braking zone, it's very, very close to 0. It never varies more than 0.2, right? It's always right around 0. Now let's look at it to define turn-in. We're watching that lateral G number start to increase. Okay, so the big thing that we're talking about right now is where am I on the friction circle and where is that on the racetrack? So what we're literally doing is pressing this play button right here and watching where the dot goes. Everybody try that while you're looking at your own. Watch where the dot goes. Watch an entire lap and just compare. My car is here on the track and the dot's here on the friction circle. Watch an entire lap. We'll keep watching. Okay, does that make sense? Watch an entire lap. You can also watch an entire lap and watch the apex light bar right there and the dot and see how they correlate. That'll really help. So just basically think about the apex light bar as showing you where you are on the friction circle, how close you are to the edge of it. How do those red lights get defined? That's the real question, right? So that's what's unique about Apex that other systems don't do, is they don't predict where the edge of the friction circle actually is. So why we're seeing red lights right here at this point on the straightaway is because I'm only accelerating at positive 0.16 G. There's somewhere else on the lap where I've accelerated in a straight line harder than that. All right. I've accelerated with otherwise similar conditions harder. I'm going 97 miles an hour. So as speed increases, our longitudinal G is going to slightly decrease, right? We're not going to accelerate as hard. As we go faster and faster and faster, speed can increase without acceleration increasing, right? Acceleration can decrease and speed continue to increase. So the apex lights are simply saying, hey man, at some point on the lap, you've accelerated harder in this condition than you are right now, which is true. Just remember, they're red for everybody on the straightaway, not just you. Red for everybody, and it's the same for everybody. So the title of this webinar was using Apex lights and the Apex score to define corner entry analysis. I was a little maybe optimistic that I would be able to get through all the content we just covered on the friction circle and talk about that. So we'll kind of end with one suggestion when you see certain light patterns, what that means. But before we do that, I want to talk about the number that you see over here. So there's a formula for that. And it's a simple one. It's not a super complicated one. So the formula for that, the way to think about that Apex score value is simply the number of green lights divided by, getting a call. I don't know how to, here we go. I'll talk to her later. Sorry, Lita. It's the number of green lights divided by the number of red lights. So green divided by red. Let me send her a text real quick so she doesn't think I'm contracting coronavirus. It's not funny, too relevant. So green divided by red. Green divided by red. Al says never ignore calls. That's probably true. She'll understand, hopefully. So green divided by red is apex score. So next time you're looking at that aggregate number, just think green divided by red. The more green lights you see, the higher the score. Also really important to remember when we're talking about the apex score number is that it takes a couple of laps for it to calculate, right? It takes a couple of laps for it to understand. So your first lap's always going to have a high score, right? And then it's going to start to understand what's going on. I like to look after my first faster lap. So on this particular case, that 75 is probably very accurate because I had a really quick fast lap. If your first 3 laps are slower, your apex score is probably bogus until lap 4, right? Look at whichever lap you had that was relatively close to what your ultimate pace was. After that lap, the apex score number is going to be very accurate. Never use the first lap. The second lap can be very accurate, though. So if you get up to speed within a couple of laps, the apex score number is perfect. Just stay focused on that. Thank you. So let's talk about how we get into, I think Abe is raising his hand. Abe, would you like to talk? Let me figure this out. I haven't done this before. Hold on a second. Abe. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing. Abe, you're raising your hand. I'm going to let you talk. All right, Abe, tell us what you're thinking.
I clicked raised hand by accident, so I guess.
You want to say anything while you're here?
No, this is super cool. I really appreciate you doing these.
Awesome. If anybody else wants to talk, just raise your hand, and I will let you talk. Cool. I hope this is helpful. I'm going to mute you again. Bye, Abe. All right. Let's go back to the screen share here. My wife just came in and dropped off I'm doing actually another webinar this afternoon. I need a different t-shirt. Get my screen sharing back up and going. Reminder, guys, to ask your questions in the Q&A box. I'll wrap things up promptly at 1 o'clock here. So if you have questions, go ahead and enter them now. And I will send up some follow-up details. The whole webinar is going to be recorded. So I'll send you that. It'll take quite a while for me to upload it because it's going to be over an hour. So you'll be able to follow this back along. Okay, so now that we're looking at, first of all, let's talk about corner entry. I'm going to go back to our standard threshold braking corner. For those of you that don't know Barber, turn 5, which is where my blue dot is right now, is our threshold braking corner. You can see the red longitudinal G dot at the bottom of the friction circle. Apex lights, for me, I had a little potential there. I probably had about 10% more braking capability that I could have used. So Michael says our average percent values, green divided by red, could exceed 600%, or green, which would be top out at 100%. It's whichever one is going to be under, the number is going to be less than 1. So maybe it's red divided by green. Did I get that backwards? It's going to be whichever one gives you a point something value. I've got a lot of numbers running through my head, so easy to mess that up. Red divided by green. Red's a bigger number. Green divided by red's a smaller number. It's going to be green over red, like as a fraction. That's the way I would think about it. I believe that would end up with a point value, right? Green would be 85, red would be 95, something like that. Basically, it's the percentage of green lights that you saw out of 100. How about that? Let's add in our poor example session when we're going to talk about, so now we're going to talk about, okay, we understand the friction circle and we understand how the apex lights relate to the friction circle, but why don't we talk about, what it looks like when you're not doing it correctly. So this is pretty good. This is not something, these 3 red lights, I definitely have more potential to go get those. And once we slap the arrow on this car, apex scores are higher, which is another topic we can talk about. But what I'm looking at here to understand these lights is the bottom of this friction circle. And without having exact data that goes, oh, the friction circle is this much bigger, the best I can do is say, oh, there's 3 lights there. I can probably brake a little harder. Right? I can probably brake a little harder. That's the most information that I can get out of that. That's very helpful information, because if I didn't have the Apex Pro there, I might be thinking that I'm braking at the potential. But very obviously, I can see more. The reason that it's showing that, again, is because it's taking in those longitudinal and lateral G values. It knows what speed you're going. It knows where you are on the track. And it knows if the track is doing this or this or this or this. And so it's comparing that acceleration and interpolating it, meaning comparing it essentially to other accelerations on the lap where you might have had more total G or more G in a similar situation. And that's how it knows that there's some potential there. It's going, where else have we seen this acceleration? So I'm going to add in this other session that I sent you guys. by tapping add another session. And it's easy to find because it's called the bad example session, and it's right here. And what I'm going to do here is toggle down to one of these drivers' laps. And I'm going to look at something that we call coasting into the corner. Now, we all know that we're not supposed to gingerly release the throttle and get on the brake. We're going to talk about that more in the speed trace webinar. So the speed trace webinar is going to talk a little bit about how you identify coasting with the speed trace. Right now, I'm going to identify it with the friction circle. First of all, that bottom friction circle, the shape sure looks a lot different, doesn't it? Let's identify that first. Look how many more values are plotted in the center of the friction circle. Right? And the apex score is lower. 76 apex score, 67. So we know immediately, I know without looking any further, that this driver is struggling. The other thing I notice right away without doing anything else, since I've got apex score coloring my friction circle, look at this. That driver at almost peak lateral is seeing yellow plots on apex score, meaning apex is a lower value, right? Apex score is a low value. That means there's tons of red dots right there, which means that this car can do a lot more peak lateral than what it's doing right there. It can also do a lot more peak longitudinal than what it's doing down here. We're only seeing 0.8, all right? Everybody see that? Yellow dots right here. Yellow dots over here, close to the edge, close to the edge. That's really, really good information. The other big thing that I want to look at right here is how this driver approaches this turn 5 braking zone. All right, he's going to be accelerating, accelerating. Let's watch how slowly that blue dot moves down. All right, what we're watching for is the blue dot right here, right here. And to back it up, watch how slowly it moves down towards the bottom. Bloop, and now he's decelerating hard. Let's watch this lap. See if we see any differences. All right, there's a difference there. The difference is the number of plots. On this one we're looking at, the good example, are fewer from that positive acceleration to max deceleration. Whereas this one, there's a lot more, right? There's a lot more time that he spends in this kind of like the acceleration area right here where it's just kind of, look at that in the middle. All right, guys, if you're seeing that right there, see where this blue dot is? I'm moving it back and forth. If you're seeing dots like that right there, that means we're real comfortable around 0 acceleration, which is what it would look like if we were driving on the street. Almost 0, right? All the time. We're not accelerating hard. We're not braking hard. We're not cornering hard. Almost 0 all the time. So what I'm seeing if I go to, let's say we go to apex score up here, is almost the inverse of our example session. This driver is braking hard right here. So now the track is colored by apex score. Now we're talking about using apex score on corner entry to learn if there's more. So all I want you to watch right here is see how the apex score is now colored over the track. Apex right here. Apex is displayed over the track. This is where apex score gets to be a high value. Let's define where he's actually going to the brake pedal. So watch the speedometer. Let's define where the driver starts to brake. When does that speedometer decrease? So we're still increasing, and now it's decreasing. All right, now we're at 83. Now we're at 80. This driver is not applying the brakes firmly enough because I'm seeing brake application approximately here, and apex score does not peak until here. This driver is squeezing off the gas. He's in the middle of the friction circle. He's easing into the brake pedal, easing into the brake pedal, easing in, and then he's going more. And then as he gets into the corner, apex score builds because he's getting closer to the limit. Guys, if you're seeing this right now, we need to fix that. That's going to be attack that brake pedal. Bam. Hard. We shouldn't see a lot of red lights on the initial braking. All right, we should see very few. 2 to 3 is acceptable. Maybe acceptable variance. Because there's places where you're not braking super hard, right? Might be a lighter brake. So if you're seeing what this driver's seeing, let's watch the lights. I'm going to put this right here. If you're seeing what this driver's seeing, and we're going to accelerate, transition to braking, look at all those red lights. If you're only seeing green at this point, right, anyone can do that. right? Anyone can do that. It's about seeing green lights from the time you apply the brake until the time you exit the corner. So right away, what I know with this driver, and I'm going to make one more point after this, last one on this one, is that he's coasting into the corner. And the biggest thing for him to be gained, where he saw the most red lights, was on initial braking. Initial braking. And it's really simple for Apex Pro to know that there's more potential when this driver is braking. Because if he's braking right, in the middle of the friction circle right here, it automatically knows. There doesn't have to be anything more sophisticated. All it has to do is go, whoa, we're only braking at negative 0.4 longitudinal G, and we're braking. There's more potential there. Red lights. All right? It knows that he's braked down here, maybe on his first lap, maybe on his second lap. And I'll point out as well that this is his first lap, so the Apex Pro doesn't know a whole lot yet. So this is a very firm answer to how can it know, right? It doesn't need very much information to know. If we go back to this lap, look at that. Similar negative acceleration, but the device has learned more, right? So the hardest thing in my mind to conceptualize about Apex Score is that it's a moving target. It changes the more that you show it. So remember that when you show it a positive acceleration somewhere, when you show it a good behavior, it's going to scale everything differently now. It's going to have more data to use to interpolate to other places, to make some valid assumptions about other places on the track you could be accelerating harder. So I'll summarize what we saw with this driver is that he's coasting, going into the brake zone. He's easing into the brake instead of attacking the brake, and we see red lights initially. That's never good. If we see red lights initially, it doesn't matter if we see green lights the rest of the corner. That's not a good behavior. That's bad technique. That's going to get us in trouble and probably cause us to run off the track at some point. So if you see a lot of red lights on initial braking, especially into a threshold braking corner, take that and definitely try to fix that by attacking the brake pedal more. And the way I like to define that is, one, I like to look in the friction circle, and two, I'm watching the speedometer. I'm seeing when it starts to decrease. Now it's decreasing. He did a lot better on this lap. But I'll tell you something, I guarantee you any car on the racetrack can brake harder than negative 0.55, which is what he's doing right here. I had a Honda Civic rental car that would brake at negative 0.9, just for reference. The peak values are not as important as the displays. Let's go back to my data, and let's look at a corner that I could have done better. So I'm on lap 5. I've got a good model built up in the Apex device. It knows where the limit is. And now I'm going to approach turn 7. This is a pretty high-speed corner. I'm going from a peak speed of about 106 miles per hour down to a minimum corner speed of about a little under 76, 75 miles per hour. What I want you to watch here is, as I replay my progression of lights, I'm never quite at the edge of my already defined friction circle. All right, I am seeing all green here. All right, it's not possible to be at the very edge all the time, like we already talked about. Right, there's certain places where it's purely not possible, and the device recognizes I'm very close to the limit right now. But what I want you to watch is on corner entry to a faster corner, what indicates that we could go faster. So let's back it up again. What indicates that we could go faster on the lights? What is indicating that? So I'm braking, not very hard, and then look at the lights right here and look at them right here. Here's my combined G. So now we're seeing 0.4 lateral G. So I'm turning in, a little bit of lateral G, and negative 0.53. So I'm braking and turning, which is what's causing us in that quadrant 4 down there. But I do see red lights on the display. I do see red lights on the display. Now watch the display start to migrate towards more green as the G's load. I would say that I'm probably very close to the limit of the car's acceleration here. But how do I get on the limit all the way through here? Because I obviously wasn't. And we watched the dot track up. I didn't use any of this space right here. All right. One thing I could have done, I could have braked later and harder. That's not always the option, but I could have. I could have released the brake a little differently. In this particular instance, basically I could see just more combined G the whole way. So what I'm really trying to do is just accelerate a tiny bit harder the rest of the way. So when we see red lights kind of do that progression where we're entering a faster corner, there's some red lights and they start to build, start to build, start to build, start to build. You're going to see the most green lights at peak lateral G. But what that usually means is either you could brake a little bit harder a little bit later, or release the brake pedal sooner. Do something to create more combined G through the corner. Could also mean you change your line a little bit. Maybe you turn in a little later. So if I was looking at myself and I watched that progression, I would say try a slightly later turn in, slightly brake slightly harder a little bit later, but otherwise do things the same. Those are the things that I would look at there. All right. That's slightly different than a threshold brake corner where we're seeing all those red lights while we're threshold braking. Last scenario, if you see a lot of red lights in the middle of the corner, this is for newer drivers usually, you're probably turning in too late. So if you see a lot of, or too early, you're either way too late or way too early. If you see, let's say, we turn in for this corner and I turned in way earlier, I had peak lateral G earlier, and then my hands are straight too soon, we're going to see red lights in the middle of the corner because you're not going to be using all the friction circle. You can go to a lot of throttle there and accelerate, or the opposite end of the spectrum, you're way too late. You turn all at once, you're going to see a lot of red initially. You're going to turn all at once. When you straighten the wheel, you're going to see a lot of red again. So what you're really looking for is the progression of green to red. We're looking for that progression. But the crux of the whole thing is that if you're seeing red lights at the apex, there's definitely more speed throughout the corner. If you're seeing red lights on entry to a threshold braking corner, there is more potential to brake harder. If you're seeing red lights on the entry to a fast corner, there's more potential to be at the edge of the friction circle for longer. I'll summarize that and send it in the email. All right, guys, we are running up against our time limit here. Do we have any questions before we wrap things up and I start to put together the follow-up? I'm going to make some notes real quick because I think that was a pretty concise point at the end. And it's going to be one, red lights in threshold brake zone equals 2, red lights at the apex of the corner equals, and 3, red lights turn in to fast corner. All right, guys. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. All right, guys. Let me know what else you would like to learn on future webinars. I'll send you a follow-up email. You guys definitely shoot me an email and let me know what you learned, what you want to learn more about. I'll also send a link to sign up for the Speed Trace webinar. We've got discounts again for Slip Angle podcast listeners. Got a discount for Lap Timer Plus subscribers. So if you listen to Slip Angle, go to tracktune.com and get the discount code there. I'll send you the one for Lap Timer Plus subscribers. That's going to be on Wednesday, April 15th. We're going to talk about the ins and outs. Michael, thank you very much for joining us, man. Appreciate all the questions. Hope it all helped and made sense. Brian, thank you. Guys, I'll send this recording. Once I get it posted to YouTube, it'll probably be either late this afternoon or tomorrow morning, but I'll send it to you and with links to sign up to our other upcoming webinars. I'm happy to do another one on Apex Score if you guys want to talk about more. There's so much. I didn't want to go too into detail with all the things that Apex Score considers because it's an infinite list and would take the whole day, but my goal was to communicate, here's what the friction circle is and means, and here's how it relates to Apex Score. So the big thing to think about, Apex Pro Display means the friction circle, but it's modified for track topography, track conditions, and overall grip level. So it's actually showing you what is possible. Peak lateral G, peak longitudinal G is not possible in every corner. And that's pretty much what Apex Score is trying to convey to you. Awesome. So thanks again, guys. This was, I certainly enjoy doing it. Thank you for choosing to spend your hard-earned dollars with us. I know this is a hard time for all of us. We certainly hope to be around at the end of this. I think we will be, but every dollar helps. So thank you very much. Some Apex Pro news will be coming up soon. We're actually increasing the price of the product very soon. Lap Timer Plus is also going to have some enhancements that are being made and some price changing. So stay tuned in to our channels for that information. It doesn't affect most of you because you all already have a unit or are already subscribing to Lap Timer Plus, but just some stuff that we are doing, not necessarily in response to coronavirus. These were things that were already planned, but we're executing them anyway. So keep an eye out for my follow-up, and I'll see you guys soon. Also, we're going to have Ross Bentley on Facebook Live for too long. Should be fun. He's a good guy to have on. All right, guys, I'll send you an email. Thank you.